This is Nina Stoyan-Rosenzweig, and it's February 20th, 2013. I'm here today with Shelley Fraser Mickle, and we are talking about her life and her experiences living with polio. Thank you very much for coming today, and I guess I'd like to start just by asking you to tell us when and where you were born, maybe a little bit about your parents and what they did, family, siblings.
Well, it's fun to be part of this oral history project, especially on the eve of my 69th birthday. So we get to look back at a life I hope well lived with good intentions. I was born in Lake Charles, Louisiana, and never been back. It's like my parents flew over and dropped me, and I had to catch up, and they kept going. Because my father was a civil engineer, and in that time I was born in 1944, they were building power plants all over the country. So we moved a lot. And my mother was a frustrated actress. She went to drama school in New York and had hoped to stay up there and was encouraged to stay up there for the auditions for Broadway shows because she had a natural comedic touch. She was just like Gracie Allen with the George and Gracie, but she was great at hamming it up. In fact, so great that in 1954, when my father was sent to or asked to come to New York City, Manhattan on a business trip with one of the companies he was with, my mother trotted herself down the street while my father was in meetings and got herself on a radio show called Rate Your Mate. And the introduction of her before playing the game was so funny with the MC because she could ham it up so. And she told this story that has now led to my writing a novel about this. Everyone in my immediate family was named after Robert E. Lee. My grandfather, who was the country physician in a little town in Arkansas, was named Robert Lee Fraser. My father was named R. Lee Fraser. Like they got in such a rush they didn't finish the first name. It was just R. And then when my brother and I came along, my brother is named Lee Fraser, and I am Shelley Lee Fraser, and then Mickle is my married name. So it was like if we were named after the great general Robert E. Lee, it was an instant job recommendation, at least in the South. So that has actually led me to a lifelong belief that one day I would write a Civil War novel, which I have. But anyway, on this particular subject, that's how I was born, and that's sort of how I got to the little town in Arkansas in 1950. My father was an only child because his mother had been in a buggy accident in 1913. She was sitting in the buggy while her new husband, made rounds as the country doctor in different people's homes, and she sat in the buggy and a pig ran up under the horse. And a lot of people don't know this, but horses are terrified of pigs, the smell or the sound or whatever. And so the horse bolted and the carriage was thrown against a tree, and my grandmother broke her hip. And back then not much could be done for a hip, so she had one leg like a foot shorter than the other. And she was not supposed to have any children. And then along came my father. So he felt like he wanted to go back and help take care of his parents as an only child. So we moved to this tiny little town of 2,000 people in the Mississippi Delta, River Delta in Arkansas in 1950. And I had gone to school in that little country school for 6 weeks when I became ill, and my parents thought I had the flu. But it didn't go away, and my grandfather had invented several medicines to treat people in his practice, and he was giving me everything, and that did no good either. So, and the irony of that was that was during the trip when my parents were in New York and my mother was on the radio show. So my grandmother was taking care of me when I became ill. So when my parents came back after about 2 weeks of thinking I had the flu and it wasn't getting any better, they rushed me 75 miles away to Memphis, which had a medical center, and there I was diagnosed with polio and put into isolation hospital. These epidemics were so rampant at that time, the end of the summer and during the summer, that they actually had whole hospitals. This had been a dormitory for interns because back then doctors trained as though they were kind of still in college and they had their own dormitories. So they had taken this whole building and made it an isolation hospital where no one could come in or out because of the infectious nature of polio. So my mother and my grandmother were in greens with masks, and they were allowed to stay with me in a certain corded off area overnight because they were waiting to see where the virus would stop invading my nervous system. So I remember the most alarming thing was that a iron lung was sitting right outside my room, my tiny room where I was. And I was well aware of what that was for because we'd seen the March of Dimes raise all this money during the picture shows on Saturday. They'd stop the show and turn on the lights and pass the bucket for the March of Dimes, and they always showed these monster machines, the iron lung. But luckily I did not need that. My breathing muscles were not invaded. What I lost was from the waist down, and most of it came back except for about 3 or 4 muscles, which were more or less 90% paralyzed. So when I was 13, I had constructive surgery. One of the first, back then they were doing tendon transplants. Sometimes they used tendons from different animals, and I kept wanting one of those. I thought it'd be double cool to be wearing part of a pig's tendon. They used pig's tendon a lot. But instead what they did was take the stronger muscle in my foot and tie it to the weaker one to give some stabilization. So I've been very, very fortunate to have lived a very long life, mostly normal, able to do everything pretty much that I would want to do except maybe ski, and gave me a great excuse for not having to try other things that would get you labeled a weenie if you didn't do them. So anyway, I've been able to live a very rich life, and I always knew I wanted to be a writer. People have asked me if they thought that my illness had anything to do with that desire. I really don't think so. I fell in love with stories when I was 5, before all this happened. My other grandmother, was a pillar in the church. Her father was a circuit rider, meaning he rode a horse from church to preach, and so she was very religious, and I think she was worried that I might be the first female in the family to go to prison. So she took me to Sunday school every Sunday, and there I heard these Bible stories, which children do, and it occurred to me that those stories were older even than my grandmother, and that there must be something to stories that we needed, like air or water, or as I got older, like a good purse. But there was something for our souls that we needed to grow as human beings, these stories, and I instantly fell in love with the idea of being part of that, so that I could actually use words before I knew how to pronounce them. And when I began to write, I couldn't pronounce the words I could write, and it seemed to me that writing was a silent language, and I called it magic, and that were in my fingertips. And then when I was able to read and discovered more that every writer puts words together in a different way, and I call that the writer's fingerprints or their footprints. So I wanted to be a part of that. So actually, when I did have polio and spent so much of my time sitting down, it has made me a wonderful observer because I have sat on the sidelines. I mean, I played an instrument in the band, but I couldn't march. So there were those sorts of limitations, but it made me a terrific observer because I learned to be still and to watch and to listen and have a great curiosity about sociology and psychology to understand what it all was about to be alive and to be a human, a person. Of course, I'm wild about animals, but anyway. You have another question?
Okay. Well, I guess one thing, maybe to follow up a little bit on your stories, you did tell the story both of your experience with polio and the way that the illness changed America, and I'm going to hand you a copy of your book, The Polio Hole, which has a picture of you on the cover.
Yeah.
And
you see this, I started writing this a number of years ago, soon after my 60th birthday, because I thought maybe it was time that I did write about the psychological effects on childhood, a sudden life-changing event like that. And I was very impressed with Annie Dillard's work of genius called An American Childhood. and I've read it 4 or 5 times. And I thought, well, if I ever write an autobiography, it would be done like this, because it was not so much about her personally as it was about her mind, the psychology of growing up. And I thought, aha, this will give me my model, my structure, and my form to go after my own particular story. So I did start writing it down. And then once I did and started doing some research, cultural research that was just coming out, like the book called Polio, An American Story by David Oshinsky, won the Pulitzer Prize in 2006. That's not that long ago, so it was only recently when I started writing my memoir that all of this material started coming out about the polio epidemics and the development of the Salk vaccine and the race between Albert Sabin and Jonas Salk in producing a vaccine, and about how the March of Dimes was started by Franklin Roosevelt, and all of that history. And so this light went off in my head, like, oh my goodness, I have lived an amazing cultural history, and so this is more important than just about me. So I interweaved my personal story with the scientific development of the Salk vaccine. And I was mainly able to do this with my husband's help, because he's a pediatric neurosurgeon, so he could help me with the research materials, because it's very complicated. And I didn't know how vaccines were made. And interestingly enough, this process of writing this memoir became even more valuable to me when I read the fact that Jonas Salk, when the vaccine was developed and announced on one of the first Today shows at the dawn of television, this country celebrated like the end of the World War II. And Hollywood came to him and asked to make a movie of the development of the Salk vaccine in his life, and he said no, because unfortunately there had been a backlash of his colleagues in the scientific community who feel like any scientist should remain anonymous, and that he was getting too much media attention. And he made a few personal mistakes. He did not thank or bring into recognition people in his lab who had worked so hard. So there was some ruffling of feathers and a backlash against Jonas Salk, and he more or less threw his hands up and said, I've had enough. So it occurred to me that in the generation of young people now that are in college and studying, their favorite form of learning about stories and storytelling is filmmaking, and that they weren't ever going to be able to learn about America and the polio epidemics in a film way. And I needed to write it down in as entertaining and informative way as I possibly could. There have been documentaries about Jonas Salk, but we don't tend to take them, well, anyone that has studied literature, as I've made a life's effort to do so, you know that nonfiction documentaries appeal to the intellect, but not to the emotional life. And that is left up to literary fiction. And literary fiction, or literature and storytelling, is filmmaking in a truncated sort of way, through images only. I've worked with screenwriters, so I'm fascinated to see how their minds work as opposed to mine, which works in language, and theirs works in images and photography. But anyway, I wish that there had been a very effective film like Schindler's List, or one of these great classics that would last and dribble down to these generations below me, because we really don't understand how strong America is until you see it live through a nightmare like the polio epidemics. And people today complain or point out about disunity and hardship, but they don't know the depth of what Americans have been through and the strength of the unity. When Americans come together, it's a great country. The polio epidemics actually changed the medical schools in America, because before then there was not much emphasis on research, basic research. It was just on turning out what are called bedside physicians to treat ill people. And so once these epidemics became so ravaging and so devastating, and anywhere you went you could see a child who was partially paralyzed somehow, there was this great need to take away this nightmare. So actually money started being put into research through the government. The National Institutes of Health today follow many of the structural elements that the March of Dimes came about to be able to fund research quickly and to use separate funds for the administration so that all the funds would go toward research. A lot of people don't know that still in South Carolina there is, I haven't been there, but I've heard that there is still the farm where rhesus monkeys from India were sent to help in the research because, as you know, there are millions of flu strains, and Jonas Salk cut his teeth on studying flu, so the first thing he had to do was identify how many strains of polio are there. So they had to use 17,000 monkeys to infect and then study to see how many strains they could dissolve those ill monkeys down to, in a way of saying it. And they found 3 strains. Bulbar polio, which affects the lungs, and that was the most dangerous because those were the children who quit breathing. Paralytic, which is what I had, and then a form that's like a cold. And what we didn't know was that the polio virus has existed since the beginning of man, and most children, babies, caught it when it was very mild, like a cold, and they built up immunities to it. And then as civilization progressed and we became more sophisticated in sanitation, they did not catch the virus as early. In fact, when Franklin Roosevelt was infected in, 1923, he was 39 years old, and they began suspecting perhaps the virus had mutated to affect older people. And they don't know why to this day more pregnant women were affected and why more boys. Once the Salk vaccine was proven to be successful, all the research in answering those particular questions stopped. But anyway, that is the story in a nutshell. You want to read more?
Well, one thing, I've had students in my classes read your book, and one of the things that they're really impressed with, and I guess this goes back to the storytelling, was the detail, what you remembered from your childhood. And I guess they don't have the same memories or level of detail in their childhood memories. So that is one question that I had for you, is just, I guess you've always been a storyteller, but was that also part of your family tradition?
Oh, definitely. Southerners are raised with storytelling, and we didn't have a TV or much to entertain each other except ourselves. And in the South, before air conditioning, you sat out in the yard, slapped at mosquitoes, and told stories. And part of my family, I mean, I've always felt that my job as a child was to entertain the adults. So anytime we were around, my family and Southerners in general adore and find great joy in their children. So they will call you over to them and ask you questions that'll, it's kind of like the old Art Linkletter show of getting children to say the darndest things and then laugh at them all. So Southerners are raised as natural comedians. That's sort of part of it. But also, I'm not a very intelligent person. I'm smart, in the sense I can stay out of trouble most of the time. But I was born with an amazing memory, and that's part of what a writer has to have. And I studied Maxwell Perkins, and because I'm here at the University of Florida, I was very privileged to go into the Special Collections Department and read all the letters that Maxwell Perkins, the grand editor of Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald and Marjorie Rawlings, all the letters that he wrote to her and other people that she happened to have and are in the collection here. So I got to study firsthand the minds of one of the greatest editors who's ever lived. And he said that always his test to know whether or not he wanted to work with a writer, or if someone was really a writer or just thinking about being so or trying to be so, he said, can you remember how the light came into your room when you were like 4 or 5 years old? And can you write a paragraph describing how that light through the window looked? And I could. Now, whether or not that was the exact light that came through the window, that's part of what makes a writer, is the blending of the imagination with fact and memory. And memory is so important to a writer that's the main reason that Hemingway committed suicide in his early 60s, was he was diagnosed with memory lapse from head injuries or who knows, but he was losing his memory. And he said, there's no way I can write without my memory. So it's an essential part of that. And as a storyteller, you will find out that stories are organic, and they begin after a while, second or third drafts or whatever, or getting toward the end. They have requirements of their own and voices of their own, and they will start dictating what the structure needs. And part of this can go back to the study of mythology by reading and understanding Joseph Campbell, in which he found every culture on the planet had the same patterns in their stories. So you will learn you have to have a certain narrative character, and the hero should not act out of anger but other emotions, and some of these basic story structure forms. And so when you're writing anything, your memory, or fiction or nonfiction, you will find, of course you have to stick to the facts of the nonfiction, but still you will find that there's a natural pull towards structure. And I think one of the ways that I discovered this was pretty interesting. When we got our first video camera, when my children were little, we had a birthday party coming up. We wanted to go around and take pictures of our treasure, whatever we'd hidden, and Easter eggs or whatever, I can't remember exactly. Here I've talked about my memory, I can't remember exactly. But anyway, we went around the yard with the video camera taking pictures of the bushes and whatever, and you can hear the footsteps and the breathing of the cameraman, and you just want something to happen so bad, and nothing ever does. So, so you suddenly realize this huge need for story structure, because all the elements of a mystery were there, the breathing and the footsteps, and oh, something very dramatic is going to happen, and nothing does.
Well, I'd like to take you back to your childhood when you were sick with polio. And one thing that you've mentioned already is that your grandfather had developed his own treatments. What were those like? And what was...
Well, it's really fascinating. You know, doctors have to still work very, very hard. And as a country doctor in a large area in the Mississippi River Delta, he was just driven to exhaustion trying to take care of all of these people. And I think he wanted a miracle cure. He probably wanted, as we said in the South, waiting for his ship to come in, enough money so that he could retire. Because my whole childhood, people knocked on the back door and brought us live chickens and corn. He was paid in kind much more than in money. So somewhere like in the Depression, he decided that if he developed two medicines, one for the outside of the body, one for the inside, which he called vitamins, it would not only help people but ease his life somewhat. So it's a very funny family story, and how he taught my mother, tried to teach her. She never could learn the recipe. But he would go into high schools and give demonstrations of how he dropped cotton into his vitamins, and the cotton would disintegrate. I don't know if that was such a great medicine, but anyway, he wanted to. Oh, it's just classic, great Southern comedy. And he was caught actually for mail fraud, for selling it through the mail, and I guess advertising it that it would cure all these different things. I don't really know, but there was a trial, and as my family told me, and all of these people, you have to envision this, got in their buckboards, their wagons, and drove their mules to the courthouse to testify, witness of all the things they'd been cured from by taking my grandfather's medicines. But he was a wonderful person who apparently was very active in the community. He built the first swimming pool for people. Didn't work, but they had too far to drive, and they had to come on muleback, or I grew up when there were mule wagons still coming into town. And he got elected as a county judge, and he was on the sanitation committee. I've read all of these things that he accomplished for the community. So he had a heart of gold, and hopefully I inherited a little bit of that.
Well, I guess it couldn't be fraud if he actually believed in it. He wasn't setting out to defraud people.
No, but apparently you're not supposed to do those things through the mail.
Okay.
It was mail fraud if you're sending it through the mail, and it was not, I think these were the eras of the FDA coming into being or whatever, but I don't know the particulars of that, but it was a great family story. and to the day that my father died. He was taking my grandfather's medicines, trying to cure himself. And anytime we grew up, we called the outside medicine stinking stuff because it smelled so bad. But anytime we got hurt as a child, that's what we were treated with. And that was in our medicine cabinet until the day my parents died. So, yeah, it's a great family story. But you see, Southerners are resourceful and very creative.
So he tried that, the vitamins, that's what you took internally, and that didn't work, and then your parents came home, and you were how old at this point?
6.
6.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I had been in first grade for 6 weeks, and I didn't go back for that whole first grade because I was in the hospital for 3 months, and then when I came home, I had to go back every 2 or 3 times a week. My poor mother drove that. For physical therapy, and I had braces and crutches, and I was in a wheelchair for a while, and because I guess just of weakness. And my parents decided that they would employ a retired elementary school teacher to give me lessons every morning. And I don't remember her name, and that's to her credit that I should forget her and not put her down into posterity because of all the terrible tricks I played on her. Because I convinced her that we needed to play hooky. Recess lasted half the day, and I had her wheel me across the street to the tennis court where we could do wheelies and whatnot. I drove her nuts, in other words. I don't think I learned very much. She put me at her dining room table for maybe like an hour of what we call arithmetic. And I could always read early. I've been gifted with good language skills. I don't ever remember anyone teaching me to read. It just one day came, and I could read even the newspaper. I mean, once I could read anything. So I was hooked up that way, but I ain't so good in math. I still have trouble making change. But I tell you what, it's always a balance in life. You hone in on your strengths and live with your weaknesses.
And so you were in the hospital in Memphis then for 3 months, and your parents were coming to, or did they live in Memphis?
My mother took a house in a boarding house. She was such a good mother. So the fact that I would not feel abandoned. And half of that little town drove over and waved at me through the window. I mean, I could not, no one could come in. But I was very fortunate to have such a support group. In fact, it kind of reminded me that recently when Gabby Giffords had her terrible, tragic gun violence of being shot, the congresswoman, and everybody in the country waited for daily updates on how Gabby was doing. And that made me go back in my memory, and that's the way I felt, that almost every day there was being a bulletin put out in my little town of how Shelley Lee Fraser is doing. And my mother came to the window every day to wave at me. And she was allowed to come in at some point after I was out of the 2 weeks and declared no longer infectious. And I was moved up into another area, into a private room. And there are great stories in here about the children that surrounded me in that basic area. And they had a whole room of children in an iron lung. And when I found out that they frequently died, it suddenly occurred to me that something very serious was happening to me. So I was very fortunate, and I was always aware of being fortunate, but like all children, you don't want to be left out, and you don't want to be different. We're all different in different sorts of ways, and as long as I was in that little Arkansas town, everyone knew me and rooted for me, and I was like royalty. In that little town, my grandfather was like royalty. So we were a very fortunate family, famous for different things. It's when I developed this discomfort of going beyond my history. Like when we moved to Memphis for middle school, it was the first time dawned on me. People didn't know why I walked differently, and didn't care. You know, then it's trying to keep up with the cool crowd or whatever, and this, that, and the other. So that's when the awareness comes to bear that there is a psychological battle that one has to fight. And the sweetest, cutest things that happened when I had we had lived in Memphis. I think we moved there mainly so my parents wouldn't have to drive back and forth when I was having corrective surgery, because I was in a wheelchair then for 6 months, and I didn't go to half 7th grade. I have a great excuse why I can't spell, because I missed 2 years of school. But my English teacher in the 7th grade made me the homework. The kids had to write me letters every week, and that was their homework, and so I'm sure they hated me. But there was one guy on the back row, and the story is so sweet and so dear, I could never forget it. His name was Bill Billingham. Bill, if you are out there and still alive, I doubt you reached adulthood, but anyway, if you are, you're the love of my life. You gave me something very special, because Bill Billingham, the rumor went around that he'd just been released from reform school, and he sat on the back row. He was as big as a man. He was bigger than everybody else, and he wore motorcycle boots and motorcycle jackets and the Elvis hairdo. He was tough, and I don't think he'd passed many grades in school. That's why he was in the 7th grade, and I don't know how old he was, but he was as big as my father. He wrote me the sweetest, most loving letters, and it's a great lesson that you never know what heart is inside of a physical being, because I know Bill had a hard time. That's why I wonder if he even made it to adulthood. But he's the first one that taught me that writing well is to pretend like you're writing a love letter to someone who cares about you, because he felt very safe sending me letters, and they were so tender. Great story, huh?
That is. That's wonderful.
Yeah. I mean, he was one of several that was horrified when they chased the teacher around the room. My math teacher, I thought, here I am in this big city school, it's like blackboard jungle, oh my goodness. And I was this sweet, innocent little girl from the Mississippi River Delta, wearing Angora collars and a ponytail and poodle skirts.
Well, and speaking of stories, I wonder if you could tell, there are a couple of stories in there when you were first ill and you were in the hospital about, that I think are important for physicians to bear in mind, about coffee and ketchup, and I wonder if you would share those with us.
Well, actually, what happened was I've already laid the groundwork to the fact that my mother was funny and enjoyed being funny and humorous and looking for the humor in life. So when I was 4 years old, I had so many strep throats that my tonsils were taken out. And they have found a correlation between people who contracted polio and having tonsillectomies. So anyway, that was part of this scenario. So I was 4 years old, and I had my tonsils out, and my throat was so sore that I couldn't eat anything, and my mother started giving me warm coffee, and she would put half of milk in there. So I existed on a cup of coffee several times a day, to the point that I got addicted to caffeine. So I have terrific caffeine headaches if I don't have my coffee first thing in the morning. So I was like the only first grader who had to have a cup of coffee before I could answer the roll or do anything. I was indulged as a child. So, and then the other part of that, we'll put them both together, was ketchup. I think all children love ketchup because there's apparently a great deal of sugar in ketchup, but we put it on everything. And I would sit at the dinner table, and that's when you're learning etiquette and authority and supposedly respect for authority. And I had this, well, I was named after Robert E. Lee, and there's my excuse. I was naturally rebellious, so when my parents would tell me to eat my English peas or whatever, I don't want to. And they said, well, you're just going to sit here until you do then. So I would take the ketchup bottle and just put it all over everything, to the point that they were just horrified. But then I would eat it. But ketchup was my food savior. So I was addicted to ketchup, but actually I think that was my authentic self, my spirit coming out, my ability to get around authority without breaking the respect of authority. So anyway, here I am in the isolation hospital, and I wake up in this ward with children that I couldn't see because all the beds were pushed against the walls. And I had to have my cup of coffee. So I asked the nurse for a cup of coffee, and she said, oh goodness, children don't have coffee. You know, that's not acceptable, that's not right. So then when lunch comes, I asked for ketchup, and they gave me a little dab. I said, oh no, this won't do. So actually, for a 6-year-old, my mind, these were the greatest tragedies, was that I didn't have my coffee and I had a horrible headache, and that I didn't have the ketchup that I needed to eat what I wanted. So I sent word out to my mother, who would come to the window. I said, I need coffee and I need ketchup. So as soon as I was allowed to move up a different level, my mother came in with a big thermos of coffee and a huge bottle of Heinz Ketchup. And those were my the ways that I was able to cope. I had something that nobody could take away from me without great trouble. And basically what I remember most was how stiff I was after even while I was in the isolated ward, I couldn't sit up. I was so stiff, I was like made out of wire. And kids are resilient, and they're going to do that. And I had a little train in the bed with me that I wanted to play with. So I found a way to sit up with my legs all bent underneath me. And when the doctors made rounds, they said, oh my gosh, look at her sitting up. And then they decided that was not good because it was going to add to the deformity of the muscles that were being lost. So I was not allowed to sit up. And that was really, really hard because I couldn't play with that train. You know, it's really hard to lie down on your back and play with this train. I look back and I think, what in the world did we do in that isolation hospital? I don't even remember a radio. There was no TV. TV hadn't been really invented yet. I mean, it was invented, but it was not around. I don't know how we entertained ourselves, but we survived it, and I think in some ways we're much richer for it, because I worry about kids today who don't know how to look another person in the eye and tell a story and listen. You need a listener to learn to tell stories. But anyway, yes, I have a lot of memories. And they don't go away. I'm like an elephant.
So when you went back, I know that in some periods in America's experience with polio, after someone had the disease, there was a fear among people they encountered that they might still be infectious. Did you ever feel or find that people were avoiding you?
I did not experience that until I was an adult. No, it never occurred to me that people didn't understand that once you're infected with the virus and it moves through you, it's gone. You know, there was a lot of discussion when post-polio came out in the 80s. Was the virus like chickenpox still alive somewhere in your body? No. They have discovered that with post-polio, the muscles that were not lost to the virus, the other muscles have compensated, and those nerve cells are dying with age. And they're also finding that the children who were in iron lungs are the ones most affected by post-polio, because a lot of the kids who were in iron lungs, once they got out, they were fine, perfectly normal. So my heart goes out to those who have experienced those enormous drawbacks. I've talked to several who have led very active professional lives and then suddenly have had to go into a wheelchair or other aids that they never thought, because there are certain parts of their bodies that they weren't even aware were that affected, have broken down and aren't working very well, you know, and I've just gotten old.
You haven't had any issues with post-polio?
Well,
then?
I think in the last couple of years, because I'm 69 now, and I'm also heavier than I should be, and that's part of aging and the fact my horse is lame. I haven't been able to ride or get the exercise that I used to, or play tennis. I was a very avid tennis player for 20 years until the pounding was too much. But no, I've been very fortunate to have lived these 69 years with so much activity in my life and mental attitude and grit. I think they've found that polio survivors are gritty by nature. We're all tough and not willing to admit that anything happened. And I look back and I think, you know, more should have been paid. More attention should have been paid to those children who were so tough and so affected. Like in my 5th grade class, we were in Kansas one year for my father to help build a power plant up there. And there was a little boy in my class who had to have a sling to help him sit up. You know, he'd lost so much muscles. But these children were everywhere. You know, there were always 2 or 3 in every class. And there really were not any considerations made for them, which is okay in a way. We didn't want those made. But I think that more attention should be paid in the sense that they're tough and they're heroes in their own world, in their own way. Like Franklin Roosevelt apparently was so embarrassed that he'd gotten a children's disease. And then there was this movement recently that maybe he had Guillain-Barré syndrome and not polio, because he was ashamed that he should have caught a child's disease. So that element of trying to hide and being ashamed of what happened to you is not the way to go. Yeah, so I was very fortunate that I was able to pretty much do everything I wanted to. Plus I had that wonderful little town that treated me so special, and because they knew me before, it was that same person was there after for them, and they never looked at me differently, and they never treated me as though I could be contagious. In fact, all the kids would get in fist fights over who would get to sit by me. In different assemblies or whatever. I had more boyfriends than I could count. They brought me things to school every morning that their mothers had made for me, so I was made to feel very special for all of those elementary school years.
Was there anyone else in your town who came down with polio at that time?
No, and that's weird, isn't it? Other than the fact that, you know, they did find, I think maybe my mother kept me too clean, because we lived in a very rough part of this nation, and even today, I don't think people understand the level of poverty that exists in certain areas in this nation, and in particular the Mississippi River Delta. Sharecroppers were everywhere. Even though we had segregation, we had white sharecroppers. I think that the kids lived, I mean, half the kids came barefoot to my class. So I think they were so immunized. And then I had moved just there from Hot Springs, Arkansas, where I had gone to kindergarten. Luckily, I went to kindergarten, which my parents had to pay for. There were no public kindergartens. But I think I was such a pill at home that they scraped up the money to get rid of me for half the day. And actually, that served for having missed the whole 1st grade. But no, we had kids in that area were tough. We were true grit. It was almost like a frontier community, and so I think everybody was immunized.
Okay. And you had a brother? Did you have? Do you have
I'm sure everyone in my family was immunized from me, but there were no residual effects, and I don't know how that happened, other than they were immunized by my
early
being
contact.
near. Yeah. And why in the world I was the one? Who knows? You know, but you can't go. There are no answers to those kinds of things in life, and that's what makes, I think, living now in our modern age so difficult, because we grow up thinking we can control absolutely everything, and then we're thrown a curveball, and a lot of people don't know how to handle it. You know, I've always had an inner strength to where anything that came along, I felt equal to it. And I've tried to teach my kids, and they have, they're wonderful adults. But life is a process of problem solving, not reacting to what happens to you, but taking it and analyzing it, problem solving. And my father, being an engineer, was very much like that. For instance, when my surgeon, who started out as like a resident with me, decided that my feet were deforming so quickly that he thought maybe he should operate and stabilize them before the age of 13, which would give me my adult bone growth. So when I was in 3rd grade, he told my parents he thought he ought to go ahead and do the reconstructive surgery. And my father, being an engineer, said, well, I think we need another opinion. And they put me in the car, and we drove all the way to Rochester, Minnesota to Mayo's in the snow. That took a lot of guts, and had a thorough workup. there with supposedly the best physicians in America at that time. And the report came back that no, wait. There was no real reason to do it now. Wait until I was 13 and had bigger feet so I wouldn't have to wear baby shoes all the time. Like a Chinese woman or whatever when they wrap their feet.
Bound feet.
Yeah, the bound feet. But my father was smart in that way, in that he never took one answer. He always looked for a second. And I think that was his logic of being a civil engineer. And he was a college graduate. And back then, you didn't go to college if your parents couldn't afford it, unless you had to be a GI loan. And my father was not in World War II because he was busy here building power plants, supposedly. So anyway, I think that logic holds you in good stead. And that's the route that they took. And my mother was really a wonderful mother through all of this, because she never made me feel inadequate. They always treated me. Actually, there was an element that they wanted to get rid of me for part of the day. So when I fell in love with horses and all of that, they said yes, I could cash in some college bonds, and I bought an old workhorse. They thought it would be good for me, and I stayed gone on her back, poor thing, 4 and 5 hours every day in the summer. I lived on horseback. And I could go all over that whole area of like 20 square miles. They never knew where I was. And I'd pick up old stray dogs, and they'd go with me and follow along. But I rode that horse to death. And my parents never knew how dangerous it was or what I was up to.
What adventures.
Stealing watermelons and doing all these things. I think they were glad to have me going. But I was always pretty gritty, and I think they knew that I would be smart about what I was doing.
So was that in Arkansas then with your horse? So your family moved to Memphis. Did they move back to Arkansas or?
Never did.
Oh, okay.
No, my parents are buried in that little town. Yeah, where my father grew up and went back to take care of his parents. But no, we moved to Memphis, the big city, when I was to have corrective surgery, and my father then helped build the power plant in Memphis. But I think that partly it was so they wouldn't have to travel so much, because this was like a 6-month investment of my having corrective surgery.
And that was when you were 13 then? Okay, so between 6 and 13 you were riding your horse around the Arkansas countryside.
Yes, and I think there was a scene in here in my memoir of when my parents took me to Mayo's Clinic in Minnesota, and they said, no, you don't have to have surgery now. And I came back and started singing all day long, home, home on the range. I was back in my bliss. It wasn't going to end, because I dreaded so terribly being taken away from my cowboy life.
So your love of horses has continued throughout.
Never went away. Never went away. And I think you're born with it. And I can't explain it, but there's just something about them that enchant me. And I've always loved them, and I've always had to be really smart about them, because they are such dangerous animals. People don't understand that. They're like riding cats. They're herd animals, and they really don't care about you. They never bond to humans like dogs do. They'll tolerate us a little bit, but no, it's and I have my own formula or ideas about that, and why it's a archetypal obsession with girls at a certain point. No matter if you have the horse love like I do, most girls always move through some element of it, and I think it's a biological need to learn how to finesse power, because you can't go one-on-one with horsepower, real horsepower. You have to learn finesse. And so I think there's biologically, Freud would love to talk to me if he were still around, but I think that there's something innate within the female biology that tells all of us as women, you need to learn to finesse power, because you can't overpower a male. And so horses are a natural draw to learn to do that. So I've always had to finesse, and like my horse knows to, I trained her to come over to the fence. I climb the fence to get on her, and she comes over the fence and gets me. So I've learned how to work around what I can't do, and never letting her know she can win.
So how do you finesse power with horses then? How do
there are a million different ways. Tricks. If they don't want to lead, if they balk, one of the things you can do is tuck their ear under their halter or bridle, and they'll get so distracted that they'll follow you because they're trying to shake their head loose from whatever you've done. And a lot of these things kind of spill over into being a good mother with toddlers. But distraction is everything. If my horse won't go in one direction, I go in the other, the one that she will go in, and then we turn around and she doesn't realize she's going the way I want. Things like that. And then I took lessons recently in the last couple of years when all that information came out about horse whispering. So I know how to horse whisper and talk in their language because they're prey animals. So they'll run from you if you have a whip. So you make them run and then you change their direction like you're the alpha mare of the herd. Pretty soon that gets into their mind. Mm-hmm. It's so fascinating because this week on the viral video, there's this horse that has let all the horses out of the stable by opening the locks, but she never opens her mother's stall. She doesn't want her mother out because the mother is the alpha mare. So she goes around. Isn't that amazing? Mm-hmm. So anyway, but I know why that works. I know how that's going on. So I always have to learn to be the alpha in the horse's mind.
Oh, that's great. So then you all lived in Memphis for how long?
Long time. I lived there. I went to college from there. I went to University of Mississippi because I heard that Faulkner lived on the edge of the campus, and he won the Nobel Prize. I knew that much. And I wrote him a letter and told him I was coming. And that I wanted to be a writer, and I heard he was pretty good at it. I hoped if he saw me on campus, he'd come over and introduce himself. And then he died in July when I arrived on campus in September, and I took it personally. I thought he'd done it to avoid me. But I got to hang out at his house. It was not a tourist. It was still in the family's ownership at that time. So that was mainly the reason I went to University of Mississippi, plus it was only 60 miles away from Memphis. But that was my home until I married and left for good, more or less.
And when did you meet your husband?
I met my husband when I was working. After I finished college, I wanted to work in mental health because I wanted to diagnose everyone in my family. So I got I was waiting for a grant to put me through graduate school in psychiatric social work. And I knew I wanted to be a writer, but I knew that I was a middle-class white girl, and I wanted my experiences to be stretched. So I knew that if I became a social worker in Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, they were hiring a lot of them, I would have a great opportunity to enter a lot of different backgrounds and cultures and whatnot. So I was biding my time to start graduate school, and I was working at Vanderbilt Hospital in the ward for emotionally disturbed children, and I worked nurses' shifts. And my husband was a medical student there. He was the third year, and when I went on my shift, I was assigned maybe 2 patients to take care of, and one of the things we did was take them to the drugstore or out on a little walk or something to get them off it was a locked ward. And my husband was doing research on the side of going to medical school on Parkinson's disease and the basal ganglia, which is associated with that. And their experiment animal was opossums. So he would bring the baby opossums out hanging upside down on his finger, and I would take my little charges down there to see that. And that's how we met. That was a great children's outing. I mean, how many of us get to see baby opossums hanging upside down off of a finger? That was pretty exciting. That was some courtship, huh?
Well, so did he do that so that you would bring your charges to come and see him? Was that his reason? Yeah.
Well, I think he heard the rumors that I was difficult, intrigued him. Because I did not have much respect for the social mores then of segregation or whatever. So I stirred up trouble just in a very quiet way. I'm a quiet person and perfect Southern lady, raised to be that way, but I would have breaks in the Vanderbilt cafeteria with my black co-workers, and that was not allowed then. So the rumors were that I was different, that I could be difficult. But that sort of intrigued my husband. I think he's paid for it since.
So you were sitting at their table rather than coming to
Well, we would have breaks, and we would come down together. And I was 23 and cute. And you don't go to the University of Mississippi and not take makeup and wardrobe 101. I mean, if you that wonderful movie that came out, The Blind Side, that was my culture. And when I saw that movie come out, I was just elated because it says so much about to my family, where I came from and what my culture and background were. Exactly, yeah.
And then, let's see, so from Vanderbilt, where did you go? Did you come straight to UF, or?
No, when my husband finished there, medical school, he was a real smart cookie. And he was one of 8 surgical interns at Harvard, Peterbilt Brigham. So we went there, and he always knew he wanted to do neurosurgery. So we were there for 8 years until he finished his training. And then he had to go in the Air Force because of the commitment made during the Vietnam era. And we were sent to Keesler Air Force Base on the Gulf Coast in Mississippi. That was a real recycle experience. And then the double interesting thing was that my son was born there at Keesler Air Force Base, and now he is a PhD fisheries biologist living there on the Gulf Coast, like a mile from where he was born.
Oh, so where does he live then?
And he just bought a house in Biloxi, but he's at the Gulf Coast Research Center in Ocean Springs. Okay. Yeah, but that's just so ironic that
he's back to his.
Yeah, back to where he was born. We were there 2 years, and then my husband sent word back to where he finished at Children's Hospital in Boston that he was looking for an academic job. And when the one at the University of Florida came up to be the children's neurosurgeon here, that's when we came.
And what year was that?
79.
Okay.
Yeah, and my kids were ready to, my oldest daughter was in first grade, so I was ready to settle down and say we're not moving for a while, because I knew I didn't suffer much from many moves, but my brother did, because he's older, 4 years older, and he actually had to be put back a grade, and it damaged him terribly psychologically. And so I definitely wanted, once my kids started school, to be stable and to put down roots in a community. That was one of my dreams or aspirations. And we have. It's been absolutely wonderful to know so many people in the community like you and different people. You know, like I have a handful of people, like over the weekend, this is kind of interesting, my new publisher for my Civil War novel that's just coming out decided to have a contest to see which cover he designed too. And so he put them on the internet, and he told me to send that link to all of my friends and have them vote. And then he set it up like a contest between authors with books coming out this fall who got the most votes. So I spent all weekend sending that link out to everybody I could think of. I just didn't quite get to you, Nina.
I know.
And, I know. And as many as I could send out over the weekend. And he wrote me back and he says, "Gosh, you've got 53 friends in 2 days who have voted on this cover. I just feel so good." Of course, I put in the subject line, "Urgent." Vote.
Vote now.
But it's wonderful to have put down roots and to have this many contacts and to try to, I came to community service late in my life, I think, but I have discovered that the greatest joy is doing something for somebody else and for a community. So I've had a wonderful time doing things in literacy and radio, entertaining people. I've had people come up and say, "You made my day with that funny story." And I don't think I would have been given quite that opportunity had I been in a bigger pond or whatever, or there was a fair amount of discrimination in Boston with this accent. At least in the late 60s, so I'm not sure I would have been given as many opportunities as I have here. And I've been very fortunate with my career, too, my writing career, to be able to do what I've done and not be in New York.
Okay. And when did you publish your first book?
I wrote short stories for many years, and I'm not very good at them, but you have to start somewhere, and I thought they were going to be short. So my apprenticeship was in literary journals, and I published about a dozen of them, I think. And then agents started asking me, do you have a novel? Because that's what we need to sell. So I started weaving some of those short stories together into a novel, and lucked upon the last great editor after Maxwell Perkins, Lewis Rubin, at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Started his own publishing company, Algonquin. And I came to him through a friend who handed my manuscript to him, and he wrote me a letter, and he said, this manuscript, it's 600 and some odd pages, so wore me out. In places, it absolutely stinks. In others, I have laughed until I've had to leave the room. And so he said, if you would like to work on this with me, here's $300 as promise money, and I will help you. So he gave me a PhD. So I was very fortunate and lucked up on that. And that we worked on it, I think, back and forth 2 years. And he would send me, this was in the days of the old tractor feed printer, and so he would send me letters, and you just unroll them like toilet paper. And they would be single-spaced, you know, writing me notes about what to change. Never told me how to change anything. That was my problem to solve. But he told me all the weaknesses and what needed to be done in terms of structure. He was the architect of the novel. And it was only later when I read an article in the New York Times about how eminent he was, that he had worked with almost every outstanding literary figure in American literary history, and a renowned critic who published over 50 books on literary criticism. So I didn't know how fortunate I was. And I also learned that he was deaf, and that was one reason he wrote in single space so many pages. That was his main form of communication. But he more or less gave me the wonderful gift of a start. And he was so well respected, and had just generally so well respected, that novel was reviewed with a whole page and illustration in the New York Times book review, and was a notable book of that year by the New York Times, and did really, really well. And then my second book, he contracted after reading the first 30 pages. He's merciless in what he requires, and he can tell in the first 30 pages if you know what you're doing or not. And so I sent him the first 30 pages of this, and he contracted it, and then he wrote me a letter and said, I'm retiring. So I lost him as an editor, but he still to this day is my surrogate father, more or less. We email and have for 30 years.
Oh.
And he will read anything that I write because he's interested in my career, and he's been so supportive. But my second novel, I finished it, and then someone else edited and brought it out. But I was very lucky that a producer in Jacksonville picked it up and sent it to someone in LA, and after 5 years of development, it became a CBS movie. So I've had amazing success. And then I found out yesterday I wrote a book based on a true story that a mother had given me of a child, a high school senior recovering from a suicide attempt. And it was used here in the high schools in the district 1 year, and a dissertation written on it to measure its effects. And it won the Florida Governor's Award in 2006. But just yesterday I was at the grocery store, and I saw a woman there wearing a Wellesley sweatshirt. And I said, oh, my daughter went to Wellesley too. And she said, well, guess what? My other daughter went to Dartmouth, and they read your turning hour in the psychology class.
Wow.
So even, you know, these little trickles, that's the beauty of why I wanted to be a writer. It may not be a big bang, and I may not be a John Grisham and have built my house on my royalties, but these trickles are affecting someone's life in a very meaningful, I hate that word, but in a very significant sort of way, is very rewarding. And we go to with such long spaces between those kinds of pats on the back that it feels wonderful to find out that something is that you've done and written and worked on that hard has some value for someone else.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so when did you get the idea? I guess, did you spend much time in your adulthood talking about polio or the fact that you'd had polio?
I didn't think anybody was interested, and it was important to not bring it up. I realized about 8 years ago when I began my 60s that, as I said, reading Annie Dillard's work about studying the psychology. I was never interested in writing about myself, but I'm interested in writing about the psychology. And as I say in my foreword, this just, it could be any child's mind, it just happens to be mine in particular. And so I was hoping that the universal would be found in me and my story. And also that I would show that grit that I think all polio survivors had in childhood. How it can strengthen you. It's a choice. But I always felt that I had something that no one else had, and it was for the better. You know, that I was tougher and understood more, and I knew from a very early age not to sweat the small stuff. You know, there are bigger things that you worry about. And I think to my children's detriment, because they'd come up with bleeding thumbs and fingers. I had no sympathy. I've raised envy. My daughter still tells me about, we were going to a tennis tournament that she was going to play, and she accidentally shut her finger in the car door. Well, you know how much that hurts. So I put an ice pack on it. I knew if we stayed home, all I'd do was hear her whining all afternoon with the ice pack. So I said, "You're going to play this match." And she did. We wrapped it up with some ice on her hand, and she played and tossed the ball for her serve or the bandaged finger. But, you know, she brings that up all the time. But she said, you know, it did make me tough, and it put things in perspective. I couldn't leave my opponent waiting. I couldn't disrupt the whole tournament. So I did pass on those lessons, and so they can complain about me all they want to now.
And when did you get the idea not just to write The Polio Hole as a memoir, but to create the Wild Onion Press?
Oh, my publishing company. In 2009, my husband's always had this interest too in children with a physical difference, but when I started writing this memoir, I realized, sort of a light went off in my head, how few books we have that feature children with physical differences in a heroic role. We have Tiny Tim, but in my opinion, he's an object of pity. And we have The Glass Menagerie. It's not said that young woman had had polio, but it's pretty evident she probably did. And she's the tragedy that happens to the mother and the son. And from an adult, mature viewpoint, I look at that and I said, how ridiculous that young woman should be the problem that the family has. I mean, I never felt like a problem. People who have differences should never be a problem. They're part of the mix. And so I decided that I wanted to do a little bit about that. And so with my husband's help, we started this publishing company, Wild Onion Press. And Rotary International was interested in having my memoir as a tool in their worldwide eradication of polio in conjunction with the Gates Foundation. So they were pushing me to have it done so quickly, and I couldn't find a New York publisher that was interested in this. And so I just decided to bring it out with our own press and a few other things that I was working on at that time, because unfortunately the big New York reviewers will not review a book from any publishing company until it has 10 titles. So we were working like crazy to meet this protocol for whatever it's worth. And so we brought out several books that I had with my agent. I just pulled them and revised them a little bit. One I did as a fundraiser for foster care. They asked me for a fundraiser. So I featured a child with recovering from a brain tumor in that book. And then we have found that our forte are picture books. It's too unrealistic for me to expect submissions of publishable novels and even memoirs that would be publishable. So we have found that our forte are these picture books. And there's so much interest now in anti-bullying that three of my authors actually have become stars. And we have one man who's a football legend, Carl Joseph. He's black, and he was born without a leg, and yet he became a football legend. He could hop down the field as fast as the other kids could run. And he's now 50, but he does motivational speaking, and we have his memoir. And then I have two picture books. One called The Gift of Grace, written by a little girl in Indiana. She was born without fingers on her right hand. She's a twin. There's no explanation for this. Doctors, researchers do not know how or why this happens, but little Grace is absolutely adorable and precious. And her surgeon has made her fingers out of her toes. And they take the joint, because then her fingers will actually grow if they have the joint bone part. So she was on the preschool playground. A little boy came up to her and said, "You must be really stupid because you've got stupid little fingers." So when her mother picked her up in the car, she got in the car and she said, "I'm going to have to set him straight." And before she could even read or write, she dictated her life story to her mother, who wrote it down word for word. And they sent it to me. And at the time it was done with photographs, and I found a portrait artist, Nancy Moscovitz, in Ocala, who did the book. And little Grace, this book won the Nautilus Award, Silver Nautilus Award, and little Grace got to go to New York as an author. And she's been on Indiana News, and now she's done a number of presentations in different schools. And the most exciting thing I think that has happened, two things. Her mother wrote me a letter in which she said, "We now see Grace shaking hands with her right hand," and she never did that before. She always hid her hand. And after she was on Indiana News talking about her book and anti-bullying, saying she never wanted another child to experience what she had, and that's why she wanted to write the book. The next day she walked into the school lunchroom. I think she's in about 5th grade now, and everyone there applauded. All the children did. So I think that in a sense this has made Grace become a little bit like the child I was in that tiny little town. She's becoming a little bit of royalty and a Gabby Gifford in which everyone cares in the way that they should, and with admiration. And so then the next book we've got,
I can take the other two so you don't have them in your lap,
is The First Day Speech, which we brought out just this last fall. I met Isabel Hidalgo when she was 8 years old, and I met her at a camp for children with limb differences. And Isabel was born with ectodermal dysplasia, meaning that her hands and her feet and her teeth did not develop in utero. It's a picture of her, but you probably can't see him that close. Her surgeon calls it lobster claw syndrome. Her hands are structured like that. So I learned from her mother. I was working with the parents of these children in writing essays about their children and a writing workshop. And the mother wrote about the fact that Isabel, before her 1st grade, first day, came to her and said, "I want you to set it up with my teacher. I'm going to give a speech." So Isabel's mother set it up with the teacher, and Isabel stood up in front of all these new classmates on the first day of 1st grade and more or less said, "Get a good look at me and get over it." And when I heard about this speech, I don't think I've ever been in the presence of such bravery. And at the time, Isabel was 8, and I said, that needs to be a book. And so Isabel wrote me a poem about her experiences, and it was not really of a standard for publication, but I took that poem and I decided that it was appropriate to think about having a Wild Onion Press book. I mean, look, I've spent 50 years as a professional writer. That's my job, and I can take these raw materials and help fashion them into a publishable book. And then to make up for my inadequacies and insecurities of being an author of children's books, I work with an editor who has outsourced from Random House, and she actually edited the Bernstein Bear book, so I'm in good company. And I send everything for these books to her. And over a period of about a month's time, back and forth, we were able to fashion Isabel's speech into a picture book called The First Day Speech. And because I'd had a limb difference with Grace, and I also wanted a boy character. We decided to come up with this fictional character named Nathan, who has a craniofacial difference. Because I think the face, of course, that any form of that that's different is even harder than any other part of the body for children to deal with. Plus, my husband has operated on so many of them. So we came up with the first day speech, and Izzy, bless her heart, her surgeon is at the Florida Children's Hospital in Orlando, and they sent out a press release about their patient having a book, and it got picked up by NBC, and Isabel was on NBC Today on Labor Day, and she's become something of a national celebrity. I think I'm in the presence of a modern-day Helen Keller, and I've sent this to the White House. I'm suggesting that they invite Isabel to the White House. But we're having a wonderful time for Isabel to go out to all kinds of schools. She's going to big, enormous schools and giving presentations. A middle school in Huntington, West Virginia saw her on NBC Today, and they flew her up to do a school-wide presentation. And then New York Manhattan flew her up to do the weather report on the local news, with the weather report. And she has enormous poise and grace, and it's just so much fun to be a part of this and to help her achieve these sorts of goals or changes in our culture. So we're real proud of this. And the funny story was that when I actually had an illustrator who works for Disney do this. When he read the story, he said he cried and he'd do it for half price. That helped. But when I sent it to the editor that I work with, the picture of Nathan, my artist kept saying, I'm most worried about Nathan. When we get to see his face, I want to work like a month or two just on getting him down. So I kept sending images of Nathan's character sketch to my editor, and she kept sending him back and saying, he's too adorable. And my husband, who did craniofacial surgery on these kids, he says, but I make them adorable. So we had to come up with a compromise. And so what we did is at the end of the book, we describe craniofacial cleft in which half of Nathan's face did not develop in the womb. And any scars and differences in his two sides of his face meeting is what he's most worried about, and that is a universal to any child worrying about anything on the first day of school. It just happens to be that he has something real special and different, but it does translate into the universal feeling of any child being apprehensive about the first day. So this book, I'm proud to say, is on its way to becoming a classic, and I think it will be around long after I'm gone, and I hope Izzy will get to enjoy it for the rest of her lifetime. And who knows, it may continue to keep going and going.
Well, thank you. So do you have any other thoughts that you would like to share about polio or about writing?
Oh gosh, well, no. No, I mean, I could go on and on because I've lived a very long life, and I think for majority of it I've been awake. There are elements of awareness, but I do think that my experience of having a very serious illness at an early age and having to deal with limitations made me much more awake to how precious life is and the enjoyment of each day and the quality of each person. I'm very tolerant for the most part, have very high standards for character and how one behaves going through a lifetime. I think a promise is a promise. Those sorts of things. But it certainly put things in perspective to me, to where I think I'm hard on my friends because I can't get real excited about the hangnail or a bad hair day. I just can't get into the drama of the little things. I don't sweat the small stuff. If I can get around and I'm not in pain, that's a good day. So, and I think I passed that on to my children. But it's been a great opportunity here in the last chapter of my writing career to be able to bring these children's stories to bear. And so I'm more or less narrowing down my focus of this company of Wild Onion Press to making a few classics that will stick around. We're getting ready to do a graphic novel because they're so popular right now, and I have a wonderful illustrator who's just bonded with me and my husband over the last 4 years. And he does graphic novels, so I'm going to write the part of it, and it's going to be teaching science, and we're featuring a little girl who has spina bifida, and she's based on a real person. She's become our model for Tessie, our character, and I can see her growing in front of my eyes. I took her to a first grade class last spring. They had all read the little chapter book that we're going to make this graphic novel from, the seed for the story. And Tessie has lights on the wheels of her wheelchair, and when I heard this story, I knew she had to be in our company because she has red hair and she lives up to it. And she's so mischievous that when her mother gives her time out, it's lights out. She has to park and not have her lights flash. So when I took her to this first grade class where everybody had read the book, it was a wonderful experience because, again, little Audrey, her name is Audrey, was royalty for the day and took royalty out of that room that day with her. But the kids ask her questions. What do you do on the playground? And she said, well, I play like you do. And then she wheeled in front of everybody and did twirls and made the lights flash. And it was just a wonderful interchange. And right there in front of me, I saw those children in the first grade growing, just like watering plants. Their minds, their tolerance, their understanding, their toughness, their respect for another human being just grew. And no longer was there this sense of curiosity, this sense of, oh, poor you, this, that, and the other. It was like, oh, wow, you know, you get to do that, and this is wonderful, and now you're in a book, you know, and it's just, that's the power of story. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. All right.